Last week, we spoke about the rise of Israel and the creation of Palestinian nationalism and the modern version of Palestine. This week, we would take a look at several things, and we begin with Iran under the Pahlavis and the rise of Saudi Arabia. In the case of Iran, the issues that we've spoken about under the previous dynasty, the Qajars, were taking shape in the 19th and 20th centuries. For Iran, as with the Ottoman Empire and much of the Middle East, the First World War is incredibly destructive and really rips Iran apart in many ways, even though Iran isn't formally involved in the war. Informally, it is involved in the war. It becomes invaded by the Russian Empire, the British Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and others, and all this sort of territorial loss that we saw in the 19th century really sort of takes hold. There is a military coup in 1925, overthrowing the Qajars, who have ruled since 1796, and a new group, the Pahlavis, replace the Qajars. The man who becomes the face and the founder of the Pahlavi dynasty is this man right here. This is Reza Shah, formerly known as Reza Khan. He is a military officer in the Cossack Brigade, which is the Russian military organization in Qajar, Iran. He is perhaps not as worldly as someone like Mustafa Kemal Ataturk or the individuals we saw with Arabism like Nasser, but he's a person who is more in tune with the ups and downs of the modern world and offers something new to Iran. In this sense, he looks quite a bit in the mold, and as you can see here, is a friend of Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. In a certain way, Reza Shah's Iran and Mustafa Kemal's Turkey are sort of twins on the same path. What becomes interesting, however, is by the 1970s, this path diverges, and Iran goes in one direction, and Turkey in quite a different direction. Reza Shah, like Ataturk, is a strongman or an authoritarian, or what we might call a self-strengthener. He's going to build Iran up into something new, better, and more secular. He brings in similar reforms as Ataturk does with regards to westernization and modernization, but one distinct difference is that Reza Khan, his title, like Lord or Duke, he becomes Reza Shah, as in the Emperor Reza. And so he remains as a monarch, whereas Ataturk, although he rules sort of as a unchallenged dictator in some ways, at least is not a monarch. So that's one of the key differences. Another factor is that Iran, unlike the Ottoman Empire and much of the Arab Middle East, had not felt a real strong effect of reform under the Qajars. It remained somewhat underdeveloped. And so, in a certain sense, from a technological or infrastructure perspective, Iran really begins to modernize with Reza Shah. Building railroads, as you can see here, airports, air travel, telephones, the radio, modern ports, so on and so forth. And although Iran is independent, as is Turkey, Iran is still reliant heavily upon British petroleum interests, and increasingly becomes soured on its relationship with Britain due to what it sees as unfair trade practices. So, when war begins to loom in Europe yet again, and Iran begins to sort of seek out allies, it is a bit unsure of both Britain as well as its neighbor to the north, the Soviets, and begin to intrigue with Germany. This results in a joint Soviet-British invasion of Iran, and Reza Shah is removed from power and exiled, and his son, Mohammad Reza Shah, is put in his stead. And Iran is used as a transit point for goods from the British Empire and later the United States to Iran to sort of fight against Germany. And so Iran finds itself yet again being occupied in a war that it didn't officially get involved in. And even after the war, is involved in what we might call Cold War intrigues. After the war, as happened in Eastern Asia as well as in Europe, the Soviets and the US began to solidify their positions, and they had this sort of Cold War moment taking shape. And here are some claims that the Soviets tried to make on Iran as well as Turkey. Another group to examine is the rise of Saudi Arabia, or the Saudis, and the Wahhabi movement that takes shape in Arabia in the 18th and 19th centuries. This gets back to the idea of Islamism that we spoke about before, and Islamic revivalism, anti-imperialism that we spoke about before, and we've looked at this map previously, sort of highlighting this movement in the 18th and 19th centuries. And a couple individuals that we have associated with, we've mentioned Jamal ad-Din Afghani, we've mentioned Muhammad Ahmad, or also known as the Mahdi. The individual here we're going to focus on is Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, who is the founder of Wahhabism, and he is what we might call a puritanical or revivalist religious leader, which is somewhat different than what we've examined previously. Eventually, he's going to make an alliance with a dynasty called the Saudis, and the Wahhabi/Saudi movement is not going to always work together, but frequently will become sort of one entity, and eventually create something that looks like this, what we now know today as Saudi Arabia. That being said, there's many versions of the Saudi state. There's one of the early 18th century, one of the sort of middle 19th century, and one of the early 20th century, which eventually creates modern Saudi Arabia. One of the problems for the Saudis throughout the 19th century is that the Ottoman Empire and their allies in Egypt often came in and saw the Saudis as an enemy and stifled them, defeated them, drove them into the desert. Despite this, the Saudi state continued to return and had a great degree of popular support, especially in certain parts of Arabia. But the Ottomans also found another group that they could support, a group called the Rashidis, or the Al-Rashids, who battled with the Saudis throughout the middle of the 19th and into the 20th centuries. In the early part of the 20th century, 1906, 1907, 1908, the tables turned on the Rashidis, and the Saudis began to gain momentum. With the Ottoman Empire occupied in the Balkan Wars, as well as other rebellions that were occurring, the Rashidis in the 20s, right after the First World War, are defeated, and slowly many different groups that are emerging in the post-World War I Arabia after the Ottomans have left, slowly many of them turn towards the Saudis. And the Saudis become, in a certain sense, what one author has sort of talked about as the Prussia of Arabia, and in this case Ibn Saud as the Bismarck of this new emerging Arabia, or this Saudi Arabia. And so you can see the bits here, right? The core area of the Saudis in the center, territory captured from the Ottomans right before the war, territory captured from the Rashidis during and immediately after the First World War, the defeat of the Hashemites, who had been a British proxy, and then slowly the annexation of Asir, as well as other territories in this region, creating what eventually is known as, not right away, but is eventually known as Saudi Arabia. And Ibn Saud, this individual who could be seen as a sort of puritanical revivalist, becomes a great statesman and recognized on the world stage. This is him speaking with Franklin Roosevelt. So both the Pahlavis and the Saudis from the 1940s until the 1970s are viewed as American allies and viewed as anti-Soviet states that the US and the West can rely upon. And both of these also represent new independent revivalist or reforming entities that exist in and around the post-World War II period.